You've written a book called Murder of a Herkimer County Teacher, and this is about a case that took place in 1914 in New York State.
Correct, in a small town, Poland, New York.
And what attracts you to this subject matter?
I would say people that break the law, crime, criminality, the dark side of the lives that people lead, and what would compel people to do things like commit murder.
So there was a 16-year-old who was in sixth grade accused of murdering his teacher, but 16-year-olds usually aren't in sixth grade. They're more like 12 years old.
Correct. Gene did not learn to walk and talk until he was 5 or 6 years old. And when I talked about some of his symptoms that he had that they brought out in the court trial, some modern psychiatrists have told me that they would consider him today to be an autism spectrum disorder or an Asperger's type of symptom. So he could function, but he was falling further behind as his peers aged and outgrew him mentally.
So Gene Giannini was a sixth grader in Lita Beecher's classroom. What was the rapport like between those two in the classroom?
Well, Gene was reported to be very restless. He would get out of his chair a lot. A couple of times he tried taking his chair and facing it towards the wall, but Lita was loving and wanting to help him. She would discuss with Gene's father him falling behind and her trying to work with him to improve his skills, because obviously he had started falling behind his much younger peers.
And in her very first class, she has this child who's older than the others, who is probably autistic.
Right.
And what is she trying to do for this child?
Well, she was trying to do special training with him, and back then it was a little bit different. A couple times she had to call the principal to come down because Gene was throwing papers and getting restless and out of his chair. And actually, they described in the court trial that the principal actually took Gene out into the hallway and whipped him with a rubber hose 18 times to get him to behave. So that's part of what formulated in Gene's mind that Lita was against him, that she was not helping him.
So what actually happened the day the crime was committed?
Gene's house was almost across the street from where Lita lived. She lived in a boarding house for school teachers, because back then school teachers were not married. They were single women. And what he had done was he lured Lita by saying that this hill right nearby, it's called Buck Hill Road, that his father was building a new home up there, and would you like to see it? So she said, okay. And when he got her up on that hill is when he hit her in the back of the head with a monkey wrench and then took out a knife and he stabbed her several times.
So a young 21-year-old teacher dies, and someone is sent away for the rest of his life. What else is tragic about this situation?
Well, what else is tragic is the close friends and families of both the victim and the murderer living in a small little town. Can you imagine, of 300 people, and they all knew each other. A lot of them were embarrassed, they were ashamed. In the 1970s, the Village of Poland, New York, wrote a history book on the history of their town and area, and this case was excluded. They wanted to go away. As a matter of fact, when I was writing this book, a few people said to me when I was doing my research, can't you just let this go away and leave us in peace? And that's, to this day, it's over 100 years later. That's how raw and painful it was for that small town and all those people.
So what was interesting about the trial and how that went?
What was fascinating about it was, even though it was in a small town, Herkimer, New York, it attracted the world's best attorneys and alienists, which today we call psychiatrists, all the way up to Herkimer County for a small trial, including Dr. Goddard, world-renowned alienist who had seen over 40,000, apologize for these terms, morons, imbeciles, high-grade imbeciles. Those were the terms that were used back then for mentally deficient people, mentally handicapped people. And then he came to apply and use the Binet test in the trial.
And what is the Binet test?
It's a test that determines the mental age of a child. Gene was 16, but Dr. Goddard's test determined that he was 10. And the interesting fact was this was the first time in a trial in United States history that the Binet test was allowed.
Well, after the trial had wrapped, I understand that Gene left something in his jail cell that was discovered.
Yes, he left a poem that he had written. In the 2 days after he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, the 2-day wait before he was taken away to the asylum, he wrote a poem and left it in his jail cell.
What did that poem say?
Would you like me to read it?
Sure.
My name is Giannini, and I would have you know, and I always have trouble wherever I go. To be thought a tough, it is my delight, and I'm thinking and planning both day and night. I killed Lita Beecher with an old monkey wrench, and they took me before the judge on the bench. The sentence they gave me, it caused me to smile. It was, he's not guilty, he's an imbecile. Now here is thanks to the jurors who let me go free, the foolishest men I ever did see. When they came marching in, it raised up my hair. I thought for sure they'd say, he must sit in the chair. Now I must leave you and bid you adieu, and the dollars I've cost you won't be a few. I will never fear if I can find McIntyre, for I believe he would save me from hellfire.
Well, that poem is chilling to listen to. He felt no remorse, it seems, and he's calling the jurors foolish for letting him live, and he's even bringing it to everyone's attention that the trial cost everybody a lot of money.
Correct. At the time, it was the costliest trial in the history of Herkimer County, and he called the men foolish because I think he thought he was going to get guilty and in the electric chair for sure. He had mentioned to his father and others that I'm not afraid to die, I'm ready to go sit in the chair. I think it even surprised him that he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So of course he would think these men foolish for letting him go.
But he did not feel sorry.
No, and when I spoke with the psychiatrist who read all about him, they said that's a big part of the diagnosis that he had, the lack of empathy that someone who has high autism spectrum disorder would have.
Well, you're drawn to nonfiction stories, and also I know you've written some dark fiction as well, and you've also compiled other people's stories and put them into volumes called Adirondack Mysteries and Other Mountain Tales. Why did you want to do this?
I have a big fascination with the Adirondack Mountains. I've climbed the mountains, I've hiked, I've skied. It's just wonderful. And in my travels around the United States, you come to love the Adirondacks more and more because they're so alluring and a lot more dangerous than people think just because there are roads through there. You know, it's dark, it's mysterious, it's a different mountain range than any other in the world. So I have a huge admiration and fascination with it.
So what is something mysterious that happens in the Adirondacks in your books?
Well, one of them, and I will use a story that I wrote. In the second volume, I write a story about a woman who is a modern in our day and age. She's a forensic examiner for a county, and she decides to go on a hike with her dog, and she comes over the other side of the mountain and somehow walks through a time tunnel, and it's a town that's an Adirondack town from the 19th century. And come to find out, she uses her modern skills to save someone's life. And I thought that would be fascinating, and then they end up asking her to stay on as their town doctor. So then at the end of the story, she has to make the decision. Does she go back to her old life in our modern time, or does she stay there in the town to be the doctor?
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
You have some very well-respected authors in this series, don't you?
Yes, including John Bryant, who your viewers may know as the man who wrote the Adirondack Detective series, which is incredibly popular all over in New York State. And John was a wonderful person. He was a good friend of mine. As a matter of fact, the story he contributed to Volume 3 was the last thing he wrote before he passed away. Wonderful writer. We also have Jenny Milkman in the last 2 volumes. She is a major published author who writes all her books Adirondack-themed mysteries, so she's very accomplished. These are award-winning writers that I was fortunate enough to bring in to write for these books.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing information about your books with us, and I wish you further success with your writing.
Thank you very much.
Spotlight is supported by the Glenn and Carol Pearsall Adirondack Foundation, dedicated to improving the quality of life for year-round residents of the Adirondack Park.